Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and this is part 17 of my Whispers of the Old Gods card review. I'm still moving through the huge dump of cards that Blizzard put on Facebook earlier today. Still a lot to go, but it's fun seeing all the new Whispers of the Old Gods cards at once. So today I've got to look at 10 more cards, starting off with Darkshire Librarian. This is a 2-mana Warlock card that is a 3/2 in stats, which is always solid for a 2-drop, particularly in early game Warlock decks, which tend to be aggressive and like to trade up. But also has a battle cry, discard a random card, and a death rattle, draw a card. So essentially this is kind of a cycle through your deck card. You lose one and you gain one. The problem with Darkshire Librarian to me is I don't really know where it lives. I don't know what it is trying to do. Traditionally in Warlock, when the card discards a random card, you're getting a really positive benefit in stats. With a card like Doomguard, for instance, you get a 5/7 charge, which is nuts. But it does cost you 2 cards to do that. But it's worth the trade just because your card is so good. And there are ways to negate that battle cry. Darkshire Librarian is not a demon, so there's really no easy way to negate this battle cry necessarily. And you're not really getting much in return immediately. The 2-mana 3/2, that's normal, so you're not getting stats. You're getting essentially a card draw effect on the death rattle. But the problem with that is that Warlock already has access to great card draw thanks to its hero power. And that's a little bit slow for most Warlock decks. Plus, it just cycles through your deck more quickly, so it's bad in late game fatigue control style matchups. So it's not good. It's not good early and aggressive. It's not good late. This is essentially Loot Hoarder. This card, it's Loot Hoarder, right? It's a death rattle, draw a card, but it has the battle cry, and you're trading the battle cry, discard a random card, for +1/+1. So, right, it's Loot Hoarder. You're trading the discard effect for +1/+1 in stats. So, if you compare that to something like Doomguard, there's no comparable card to Doomguard at 5 mana, 5/7 charge. A 5 mana charge would typically be something like a 4/3 or a 5/3 in stats. So, you're maybe getting 4 total stats in gain for the discard, but also just a crazy powerful card. So just not comparable. It's like a worse Loot Hoarder in my mind, right? It's just awkward. It doesn't fit. Has no synergies, no tribal synergies. That is bad design, bad card. I don't think it'll be played unless I'm just missing some crazy death rattle synergies that can be exploited thanks to this card. I just don't like it. Up next, on the other hand, is Darkspeaker, the 5-mana neutral epic card. It's a 3/6 in stats, and it has a very neatly designed battle cry. As much as I hated Darkshire Librarian's design, I kind of love Darkspeaker's design. It's super creative, and it's hard to think about ways that this could be good, but it can actually be very, very cool. So the battle cry swaps stats with a friendly minion. So when would you want to do that, right? Typically, anytime you have a card with a really powerful effect that's either almost dead or has bad stats in and of itself, and that's already on the board, of course, you can play your Darkspeaker and kind of absorb its bad stats and give your powerful card a more likely chance to live. For instance, I'm trying to think of examples that make a lot of sense. It's kind of challenging. So let's actually just say Nerubian Egg, right? Let's say Nerubian Egg, even though it's going away in standard format. So it's a 0/2 with a really powerful death rattle, right? But it can't attack. What you could do is play your Darkspeaker onto your Nerubian Egg, and suddenly your Nerubian Egg is a 3/6 that can attack with a super powerful death rattle. So you kind of enable your Nerubian Egg and make it very difficult for your opponents to deal with, even though your Darkspeaker becomes a very weak card in and of itself. But also, it's kind of just a buff hidden in a card. So imagine you have a Silverhand Recruit that's a 1/1 that's active and ready to attack because you played it last turn. Suddenly you can play your Darkspeaker on the Silverhand Recruit and essentially give this 3/6 minion charge in a way. Because that minion can already attack, you give it the 3/6, it's now a charging 3/6. So this Darkspeaker is essentially, in essence, a charging 3/6 because it gets attacked right away. So it's kind of a buff in that sense. It's almost like a pseudo Blessing of Kings in Paladin. And it's still a 1/1, so you don't lose your Silverhand Recruit. You're basically pushing the attack a turn forward, back in time. So you're almost playing Darkspeaker a turn earlier, in a sense. Also, in a way, you can... thinking about how to phrase this. This is a very difficult card to discuss, by the way, so give me a little slack. Let's say you have a Ragnaros on the board, right? It's an 8-mana 8/8, and has a very powerful effect, right? So your opponent is going to want to kill that Ragnaros as quickly as possible because it's got a huge effect that's impacting their board or their face too significantly. So you can play Darkspeaker, right? Swap stats with your Ragnaros. You're assuming they're going to kill your Ragnaros anyway, because it's so threatening and so scary. So you can actually absorb the positive benefits of Ragnaros, the 8/8 stats, onto your Darkspeaker. So suddenly you've split the value of Ragnaros, right? Ragnaros is now a 3/6 that does 8 damage, and Darkspeaker is an 8/8 that's very scary and threatening as a body that can actively attack. So now they have a dilemma. Do I kill the weaker body that's less threatening that has the powerful effect, or do I kill the scary 8/8? You can also do stuff like deny Big Game Hunter on a Ragnaros with Darkspeaker. So a couple different ways to use this in a different variety of decks. I still don't know that it's going to be played, though. As much fun and as unique and interesting as Darkspeaker is, and the ways in which you can make it work, I don't know that it's good in aggressive or control style decks. The stats aren't that great for 5 mana, so it's probably going to lose some value somewhere along the way. I don't think it's that good. I talked it up a lot at the beginning, I know, because I think it's cool, and there's some fun ways to use it. But not that great overall, and probably just a little bit awkward and an epic cost card, so very prohibitive to craft as well. Alright, so Disciple of Cthulhu is up next. Pretty cool Pandaren monk or some kind of dude in the art that I like. This is a 3-mana neutral minion. Excuse me, it's a 2/1 in stats, which is miserable for 3 mana, of course, but it has a very powerful battle cry. Deal 2 damage. So 2 damage to anything, enemy minions, enemy face. So we've seen that effect with Keeper of the Grove and Druid before, and you've probably seen how powerful that is. Typically used to remove a minion that was played by your opponent the turn before you play your Disciple of Cthulhu. Also, I can kind of compare this card to... I'm actually blanking on the name. The Argent Horse Rider, I guess. The 2/1 charging minion with Divine Shield. In a way that operates in a similar fashion, right? So that can also... That's a 3-mana 2/1 that can also clear a minion essentially for free thanks to its Divine Shield and leave the 2/1 body behind. So Disciple of Cthulhu is kind of an alternative to that in many ways, but also, of course, has a Cthulhu buff in the battlecry as well. So fantastic in Cthulhu-style decks. And unlike the Argent Horse Rider, can actually use its 2 damage effect behind taunts as well. So if they've got that Knife Juggler hiding behind a taunt, you can still pick it off with this card. So I think this is great in Cthulhu-style decks that are trying to last to the late game but need an early curve minion to respond to the board. And in fact, as I'm losing my voice, this might even be good in general decks. I could see a handful of decks playing this card just for its really powerful battle cry, almost regardless if they have Cthulhu or not. And aggressive decks, too, could maybe even utilize this one. It's also a fantastic arena card. I think this will be a strong selection in arena to boot. So I like Disciple of Cthulhu quite a bit. Moving on to a paladin spell at 1 mana called Divine Strength. Really, really cheap paladin buff. And pretty minimal effect at that. Give a minion +1/+2. I don't think this card's that good. In aggressive paladin decks is definitely where you're going to see it. Just because they like to get minions out early and buff those minions, particularly if they have divine shields. But the problem is the stat allocation on this one buffs the health more than it buffs the attack. And aggressive paladins prefer to have higher attack minions, because under a divine shield, high attack is great because you can trade into bigger things while still keeping your minion alive. And this doesn't enable that all that much. But the real problem for this card, for me, is that at 1 mana, it's just not that valuable. So if you draw this on turn 4 or 5, it's just not doing enough. Unlike a Blessing of Kings, which can give you a huge minion, this has a very minimal impact. It doesn't really do anything, right? It's just barely adding anything. 1/2 in stats is not valuable as a 1-drop minion, and it's not that good as a 1 mana spell either. Even though it essentially gets charged in some cases, it's still not impactful. If it was a give a minion +2/+1, there's a chance this card is playable. But as it stands right now, I just don't think it does enough to earn an actual slot in a paladin deck. Even with divine favor and consideration, there are better ways to spend 1 mana and spend a card slot in your list. So let's move on to another neutral minion. This one called the Doomcaller. It's an 8 mana 7/9, which is just absolutely huge. And it has a battle cry. Give your Cthulhu +2/+2. That's something we've seen about 1,000 times from other cards. So that's fine. That's good. You've got good stats for the cost, or at least reasonable stats for the cost. Decent battle cry, and a weird effect. If it's dead, presumably your Cthulhu, so if you've already somehow played Cthulhu and it has died, this will shuffle a new one into your deck. So it kind of gives you a second chance on Cthulhu, right? I do have some questions about this card, and I don't know how it operates for sure. I think it's probably going to shuffle a fresh Cthulhu into your deck, so one that hasn't been buffed by all the cards you've played beforehand, so you'll have to apply new buffs. But there's a chance, based on the wording here, that it might actually shuffle a fully buffed Cthulhu back, just because every card so far has used the phrase wherever it is. I don't know if that means it is singular or if there can be multiple its, if there are multiple Cthulhus with this card, for instance. So in other words, is the afterlife a place that Cthulhu can be buffed? I still think it's probably going to be a fresh 6/6 Cthulhu that you can rebuff again. Either way, all that aside, I still don't think this card is playable in a Cthulhu deck. By the time you hit turn 8, even in a Cthulhu deck, you need to make pretty immediate impacts on the board. You feel pretty bad playing this on turn 8 if your Cthulhu was still in your deck. So in other words, you don't get the death benefit, the dead Cthulhu benefit, I should say. Because it's just a straight up 7/9. It still dies the big game hunter. It's susceptible to removal. It just doesn't do enough right away as a minion. It doesn't have taunt, for instance, to deny the enemy board. So if you're behind, you're just going to stay behind, and this minion will not accomplish anything. And it's important in Cthulhu decks, I would imagine, to make sure you get to turn 10. Also, I'm just not sure that if you already played Cthulhu and it didn't win you the game, then you probably either kind of misplayed your Cthulhu deck, because it should be doing like 20 damage to the enemy board. And shuffling it back into your deck probably means to me that you've already either lost, or you're so close to losing, or you're so far behind that having a second Cthulhu won't really matter. Perhaps in super fatigue style matchups where Cthulhu gets played over and over again thanks to this card, or at least a couple times thanks to multiple versions of this card. Maybe that's cool, maybe that's good. It extends the length of your deck and gives you a lot of powerful Cthulhu plays, but I still don't think Doomcaller ever gets played. I think this is one of the weaker Cthulhu cards that we've seen. So up next is a neutral beast minion at 2 mana called the Duskboar. This is a 4/1 beast, which is admittedly a super cool stat allocation for a 2 mana minion. We usually see 5 total stats bundled into 2 mana minions, but this one is a rare version with 4 attack, which sounds pretty cool in like really aggressive decks that want to do tons of damage, but the problem is it just dies to literally anything, and unless you buff this the exact same turn you play it somehow, it probably won't live to attack in the first place. And since it dies so easily and costs a fair bit for a 1 health minion at 2 mana, I think it's just going to die off and never accomplish anything, and I don't think anyone will find a way to play it. Magma Rager is probably the most comparable card to this one. That's a 3 mana 5/1, and it's really the same vein. It's a little better actually for efficiency as far as mana cost is concerned, but bad for all the same reasons that Magma Rager is bad. So moving on to another neutral minion. Seems to be a lot of just neutral minions with vanilla stats, which is fine, but they don't lead to a lot of discussion or insight. But this one's the Eldritch Horror, an 8 mana minion with 6 attack and 10 health. It's a pretty neat stat allocation with a lot of health. So it's going to be very difficult to remove. It's also not susceptible to the newly nerfed BGH. But just a slow card. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't impact the board. It's just a minion. Doesn't have taunt. Very easy for opponents to either quickly remove or totally ignore with their probably bigger board. And even if you get this out on an empty board for 8 mana, that's a big investment for a minion that can only attack once per turn and doesn't even necessarily kill everything with only 6 attack. So maybe a decent arena card in some ways, but not probably going to be featured in a lot of constructed decks. Just doesn't do enough. But cool design and artwork, I guess. Moving on to a Shaman card, the Eternal Sentinel. This is a 2 mana 3/2 and has a battle cry. Unlock your overloaded mana crystals. Sick card. I like this card a lot, actually. It's essentially Lava Shock, which is a 2 mana spell that does 2 damage. But this time it's bundled into a minion. So the battle cry unlocks your overloaded mana crystals the exact same way Lava Shock does. Same cost as Lava Shock as well, but instead you get a 3/2 body out of it. I think Lava Shock is an underrated card anyway, and very playable in a lot of decks that don't play it. And this one does a similar thing and really enables Shaman decks that are focused on board presence and building minions to unlock their overloaded mana crystals. So Lava Shock has traditionally been played in aggro Shaman, which is less about developing minions and more about just hitting the enemy face with lots of damage. And it synergizes as a damage spell with that kind of deck design. Eternal Sentinel wouldn't fit very well in an aggro Shaman that's all about spell damage. But Lava Shock doesn't fit as well into a Shaman deck that wants to get out onto the board with multiple minions, whereas Eternal Sentinel does. So very much similar cards, but fit into different kinds of decks and do slightly different things. And I think Eternal Sentinel will be very good for the same reasons that Lava Shock is good. So removing the penalty for Overload, and as we know, Overload can really help you get out to big advantages if you use it correctly. So this helps you reset the penalty and keep the momentum moving forward, essentially. I like Eternal Sentinel a lot. Moving on to another Shaman card, which I also think is pretty good. It's a 1 mana spell called Evolve, and it transforms your minions into random minions that cost 1 more. That's actually nuts. I think this card is maybe even broken. There was a boss fight in one adventure that was similar to this effect, where it would consistently increase your minions' value by 1 every turn. So Evolve does that for only 1 mana. Compared to the Paladin 1 mana spell we reviewed a minute ago, this is just 1,000 times better. You'll have essentially multiple totems on the board at most times as a Shaman player, along with a lot of different little token minions and leftover Death Rattle minions, and sometimes big minions as well. So when you start your turn, you'll be able to attack with the minions that can attack, and play some other cool minions, do some whatever you need with your mana. And then, finally, to end the turn, you'll be able to play Evolve. And all the stuff you played and that was already on the board is going to get better. On average, at least, it's going to get significantly better. It's going to gain stats values, effects are going to get stronger. Occasionally, you'll get that Sylvanas out of a 5-drop. You'll get that Tyrion out of a 7-drop. Like, crazy stuff will start to happen. And your totems, which are typically quite weak as totems, will become 2-drops, which start to get a lot better very rapidly. And if they live a turn or two, suddenly you've got multiple evolves going. You've got totems into 3-drops right after 2 evolve casts. So that's even accomplishable in 1 turn. You can evolve and then evolve again. So a 5-drop turns into a 7-drop. Lots of potential with this card because Shaman is pretty good at getting stuff onto the board in the early game. And I think there's value in this even on like turn 3 or 4. If you just got a couple minions, it's going to be worth 1 mana to cast Evolve. But it is important to note that traditionally when you transform a minion, that means it loses its ability to attack. So make sure you attack with the minions first and then evolve. Otherwise, you're likely to have a bunch of minions that won't attack. But occasionally you'll also get to attack twice if you transform into a charge minion, because it will then be able to hit the face again, which will be a nice big play. All in all, really perfect card for Shaman, and I think the most powerful 1 mana spell that Hearthstone has ever seen. It feels almost broken to me. I hope it's not as good as I think it is, because it will make Shaman a little bit unbalanced. And I could be wrong. Who knows? Maybe it's just a little bit too slow and gives your opponent too much time to react. But the potential value, this is almost like a kind of Emperor Thaurissan type card that makes everything more efficient. So who knows? And then finally, I got one last card I want to talk about in this video. This is the 4 mana neutral minion, Evolved Kobold. It is a 2/2, much like the standard Kobold Geomancer, which has spell damage +1. But this one has spell damage +2. So essentially, you're paying 2 mana to gain 1 extra spell damage, and that to me feels absolutely abysmal. I don't see anywhere this card can be played. Spell damage +2 is not that significant of an effect because this costs 4 mana. So even if you cast a Fireball and a Frostbolt, it's only worth 4 extra damage for 4 mana. So you could cast the other Fireball instead to get 6 damage, right? So especially when you compare it to a Kobold Geomancer, which would give you 2 damage for 2 mana with 2 spell casts. So doesn't feel like a good card to me in any way. Too expensive. The body is terrible. The effect is weak. It has some pretty neat artwork, but that's about it. I don't think this card will ever be played in Arena or in Constructed. Overall, terrible card, and I'm sorry to end this video on such a sour note, but thanks so much for watching. If you have any thoughts or questions about these cards, please leave them in the comments, and until next time, game on.